Hello, once again, a big thank you for choosing to give 30 minutes or so of your time to listen to It's Raining Men. I'm Daniel Rosny, and I've been fascinated with royal families for years, and I'm keen to learn about those who reign over the more than 40 countries that still have a monarchy in 2025. Right now, there are no female monarchs. There's a number of female heirs, including Sweden, which we talked about in a previous episode. So it's literally raining men. But who are they? What's their role in society? How much power do they have? And do their people still want them? That last question might be difficult to get an answer to on this episode because of strict laws in place. But we'll do what we can with our guests to give a sense of how the monarchy in Jordan is viewed. This edition is about King Abdullah II. And a quick favour before we begin. If you're enjoying the series, could you rate us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you're listening? Most kings know for decades the position they'll one day have. They train for it as best they can. They learn diplomacy, they're educated on the constitution, and they're almost groomed for a life of leadership. For Abdullah II of Jordan, that couldn't be further from the truth. He only found out around 2 weeks before he became monarch in 1999 that he was next in line. His father, King Hussein, changed the order of succession shortly before his death. At the time, Abdullah was in the military working in California with his wife Rana and their young family, and everybody had thought that Hussein's brother, Prince Hassan, who had been crown prince since the 60s, would take over, and Abdullah would spend his career in the military. But that didn't happen, and 20 years later, that change in succession would again create international headlines as Jordanian royals turned on each other fighting for power. More on that to come. First, though, Jordan is in a tricky region. It borders Israel, Syria, and Iraq. And it's been a significant player in diplomacy for generations, with the king working with the US, the EU, the UK, as well as the countries in the Middle East. Now, Abdullah has significant political powers, more so than any European king. And towards the end of last year, he gave this impassioned speech at the United Nations over the war in Gaza.
Whatever our politics, one truth is undeniable. No people should have to endure such unprecedented suffering, abandoned and alone. We cannot surrender the future to those who thrive on division and conflict. I urge all nations of conscience to unite with Jordan in the critical weeks ahead on this mission.
The king's role in international relations and his presence on the news is increasing as Donald Trump has demanded Jordan take in more Palestinian refugees, something that Abdullah has refused to do so far. The US president has also suspended foreign aid to the country. Now, before we find out how that's gone down, I want to be upfront about how we've put this episode together, because, as I mentioned, there are strict laws in Jordan that limit what people can say about the monarchy and therefore the king. And we'll hear more about that in the second half of this podcast. But to learn from those in Jordan, which I think is important, there has to be an understanding when recording interviews that commentators can't and won't criticize leadership. And that's done in order to protect themselves from the authorities. Now, I've never been to Jordan, so there's no clips of me speaking to people in the street that would normally go here. Instead, I spoke to Rana Sweiss. She's an author, the founder of a media company, and a freelance journalist for publications like the New York Times. And first of all, I wanted to get a sense from her what life is like now.
Just for the audience to know, Jordan is a country of approximately 11.5 million people, as you mentioned, located in what we like to call a tough neighborhood. Mainly, our problems are economic. So Jordan faces economic challenges with an unemployment rate right now of 22% nationally, but the unemployment youth is over 45%. So this is one of our biggest challenges today. The country also hosts over 600,000 Syrian refugees. Jordan has remained stable despite all the wars that have taken place in neighboring countries, including in Iraq, in Syria, in the West Bank, in Israel, in Gaza, etc. But as you can see, the repercussions are huge.
Unlike other monarchies that we've discussed on It's Raining Men so far, where those kings have had ceremonial or symbolic positions in their society, King Abdullah of Jordan, he has wide executive powers. So when presidents want to arrange something with Jordan, they phone him up. They don't phone the prime minister up. Could you just explain what kind of powers and duties he has there?
Yeah, sure. As monarch, King Abdullah holds significant constitutional authority. He wields substantial executive power, including appointment of the prime ministers, approval of government policies, oversight of security and foreign affairs. He also serves as the supreme commander of the Jordanian armed forces. He can veto laws passed by parliament, although the legislature can override the veto by 2/3 majority, but it seldom happens. In regards to foreign policy, the king oversees foreign policy of the country, including the relations with neighboring countries.
And he wasn't always going to be king. When his father was alive, he wasn't even the heir to the throne.
His uncle, Prince Hassan, had been the designated crown prince for over 3 decades. Now we're talking when King Hussein was, of course, alive. Everyone thought that his brother, King Hussein's brother, was going to take over.
Is that because it's the monarch's prerogative who they decide who their successor is?
Yes, exactly. In a dramatic and unexpected decision, just weeks before he passed away in 1999, King Hussein removed Prince Hassan as heir and named King Abdullah as the successor. The move, it surprised both the people and the royal family, but King Abdullah's deep ties, I think, to the military and international education made him a strong candidate for the leadership.
I've watched a lot of interviews with him, and at the time he was living in California, he was working in the military. He speaks about him and his wife, they would take turns doing the laundry. And then, as you said, because this decision happened where he became heir unexpectedly and then became king, how much change did that have to the Jordanian people at the time who were expecting a different leader?
So this is who they used to see every night on TV, Prince Hassan. They used to see him in the events, accompanying the King Hussein at the time. He was really a big figure for me as growing up, in the 80s and the 90s. This is who we really thought is going to take over. I think that King Hussein really thought that his military experience was significant and important, especially in our region. So we don't know why he made the decision. I think that this was a big factor. And King Abdullah, many felt that he was, more comfortable maybe living abroad in the military, not so much in governance. So this was really something that they had to get used to. And I think, as you can see, he's been able to keep the stability despite all the challenges that the country continues until this very day that we are talking, where President Trump has frozen, the U.S. aid, which Jordan is the 3rd largest U.S. aid recipient in the world. A lot of economic challenges, a lot of political challenges, a lot of internal challenges as well that he's had to really cope with and try to navigate with. So this is where we are today.
In the UK, the current king, his lineage goes back to 1066, William the Conqueror. But in Jordan, the lineage goes back to the Prophet Muhammad.
Yes. Of course, this lineage also gives the Hashemite dynasty really a lot of legitimacy as well. And this goes back, the lineage, of course, to Prophet Muhammad through the Hashemite family of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Sharif Hussein bin Ali, who led the Arab revolt against the Ottomans in 1916 to 1918 with British support, aimed to establish at the time an independent Arab state. And his son, Emir Abdullah I, he founded, what is today Jordan, at the time Transjordan, in 1921 under British mandate.
And you may be limited to what you can say here, but because he has been king for so long, more than 25 years, and has had this role, and you've outlined all of the powers that he has, in other countries, I'm talking about Europe here, that have monarchs, most of them have prime ministers, which sort of change during general elections. So each country has a different direction and different ideas put forward. Is King Abdullah able to is he putting forward new ideas on the table, or is it the same thought process for the past quarter of a century?
So the king introduced something called political, social, and economic modernization reforms. He has explained to the people that he envisions political parties in parliament being voted in instead of individuals. Eventually, these political parties, he said, will end up choosing a prime minister. So he has laid out also an economic reform vision as well. I think the economic challenges override political reforms at the moment, and regional instability and challenges are overriding these reforms as well. Jordanians also view the king's role as important in making or intervening in big decisions. He has a lot on his plate, and when that happens, we feel like the local reforms take a step back. And Jordanians also view the king as someone who, perhaps the same in Europe, who can kind of unify the people, bring them together. And also they see him as positively representing Jordan abroad as well, where we feel like he is very comfortable in speaking with world leaders, etc. Where Jordan is going, it's very difficult at the moment to see where it's going and whether this modernization vision of the king will take place and will work, actually.
During his reign, he's tried with his wife, Queen Rania, to change the perception of the Arab world. And, they got on board with social media very, very quickly. When you compare them to other royal families, the Japanese royal family only joined Instagram last year. The Jordanian royal court has been on it for years. If you go on it, there's just so much content on there. And the Queen's Instagram bio is a mom, a wife with a really cool day job.
I think partly it's to humanize their family and their role and how they're in touch with people and their activities on the ground as well. Maybe many people don't know where Jordan is. Maybe many people don't know what is happening in Jordan, but they follow the king or the queen or the royal court or the crown prince, and they can learn or see things they wouldn't have otherwise. So they do perhaps see themselves as representing Jordan.
Before you go, Rana, can you just tell me what your book is about? Because we can't let you leave without talking about your book.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for mentioning it. So Voices of Jordan is a book I published actually in the UK. It follows the lives of 10 people, 5 women, 5 men in Jordan, who, in my opinion, represent a large segment of Jordanian society. So they include, a Syrian refugee, a civil servant, a parliamentarian who is now a minister, a fashion diva, etc. So as you read about these people, you learn really about Jordan today and modern life day in Jordan. And not only that, but also about its politics, its history, its economics, and culture as well.
I look forward to reading it. Thank you so much for telling us about it. Thank you for your time and speaking to It's Raining Men.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's been a pleasure.
Because of laws in Jordan, Rana and I couldn't discuss some of the controversies surrounding Abdullah's reign. She outlines the country's economic struggle. But the king has faced criticism from journalists abroad, including a 2021 global investigation known as the Pandora Papers that uncovered the wealth of some of the planet's most powerful people. It reported King Abdullah II had spent around $100 million on a property empire in the UK and in America. His lawyers at the time admitted he had used his personal wealth to buy the homes, but said there was nothing improper about him using offshore firms to do so. Just months earlier, he faced off an alleged coup. That still to come. As we've learned, Abdullah wasn't always the heir, but when he did become king, he agreed his half-brother, Prince Hamza, would be the crown prince. 5 years later, he stripped him of that title. Eventually, Abdullah gave it to his eldest son instead, the now Crown Prince Hussein, who got married 2 years ago. In spring 2021, there was an alleged conspiracy against the state of Jordan, said to involve Prince Hamza, which caused a crisis in the country. It was sometimes referred to as a security incident. Hamza claimed in videos that he was under house arrest for speaking out against the king. Since then, he himself has renounced his princely title, and statements have been released apparently from him asking for forgiveness and him giving full support to King Abdullah. Now, at the time, back in 2021, all of this was playing out on social media, with extended members of the Jordanian royal family posting about developments, including Hamza's mother, Queen Noor, Abdullah's stepmom. Keeping up? It's a complicated family tree, and like all families, there are tensions and relationships that aren't what they seem to be. There's a masking involved when it comes to royalty. Good PR is needed, and brotherly love isn't always what it seems. Just look at Harry and William in the UK. But while you'll find plenty of articles about those brothers in British tabloids speculating, criticising and gossiping, it will be hard to do that in Jordan with Abdullah and Hamza. Reporters Without Borders, or Reporters Sans Frontières, is a non-profit organisation that focuses on the right to freedom of information. Each year, it ranks 180 countries in terms of press freedom. And last year, Jordan was 132nd. And Jonathan Dagher, who's based in Paris, but head of the Middle East desk at RSF, can explain more of what that means.
A rank of 132 means the situation is difficult in that country for journalists and for press freedoms. It's absolutely more difficult for journalists in Jordan to criticize the monarchy in general or the royal family. But Jordan has a system where politics works top-down. This means unlike democracies in Europe, for example, where the people vote for a parliament and parliament, for example, and chooses a prime minister and prime minister forms a cabinet that gets its legitimacy from parliament, so the people, and this is a really democratic bottom-up kind of system. Jordan doesn't really operate that way. In Jordan, it's the king who has much more than just symbolic functions, who chooses the prime ministers. The prime minister formed the cabinet. And then parliament, which is elected by the people, legitimizes this cabinet. Criticizing or covering the monarchy in Jordan is very difficult for journalists. But then, as one journalist said, all roads lead to the monarchy. And so anything that journalists criticize in politics could be construed as criticizing the monarch, because if you criticize the government, well, it's the monarch who assigned him. And so you end up in this widespread sense of censorship where you don't know what journalists can and can't say.
In 2021, the king and the royal family of Jordan hit international headlines when there was 20 people arrested as what was described as a security incident, which some media reported to be an attempted coup to overthrow King Abdullah by his half-brother, who was then put under house arrest. But there was a complete ban in Jordan reporting on what was happening.
Yeah, if you ask journalists about it, they'll tell you they don't have a lot of information about it, which is also weird because the international press covered it, but local media, I want to say didn't, but I'm going to say barely covered it at the time, and you won't see a lot of coverage in it in Arabic. That's just very symptomatic of what we were just discussing about censorship and self-censorship. And especially while that was happening, there was a lot of caution and worry among members of the press in Jordan because moments like this, they're loyalty tests. And they knew on some level that any coverage of this might be perceived as dissent, and so they just did not cover it. And that is how it works. And so this is why a lot of international media covered it, but when it comes to local media outlets, Arabic media outlets, there was very little to no coverage of the details to this day. And even now, the Jordanian public has very little information on what happened.
We've discussed polling on a previous episode with the King of Sweden, where more than 26,000 people were asked what they think of the royal court. Do they have trust in the royal court? Does that kind of thing happen in Jordan?
I mean, I'm not sure if I can make the comparison, but I would say that there is a lot of caution in criticizing the monarchy in general. One example we've had in recent years is Al-Hudud, which is a very known satirical Arabic publication in the Middle East that's originated from Jordan, that was based in Jordan. There was the prince's wedding in Jordan, and Al-Hudud made a caricature, a satirical coverage of the expensive and the lavish expenses of the prince's weddings, and they faced backlash by the authorities because of that, and Al-Hudud was censored in Jordan as a result. But it just goes to show, for example, that this kind of criticism of the lavish expenses of the prince was not accepted. There have been other kind of criticisms in the press about the vacations of the royal family or how the queen dresses. I'm not going to go into the opinions on the editorial treatment of these pieces, but I just want to say that these in themselves are very rare, and they result in pressures on these journalists because on the one form, there's the pressure that comes from the monarchy, from the state, because this could be understood as undermining the royalty. And also they have an interest in people not asking too many questions about the expenses of the royal family, particularly amid financial and economic difficulties in Jordan, which is why I would say these questions are not trivial. Like they're not just tabloids. The vacations of the royal family, the weddings of the royal family, these are directly related to the situation and the financial situation of the people in the country. And so this criticism is a big deal for the monarchy. And on the other hand, there is this perception among people, first of all, that the monarchy is a symbol, and so they respect it. And so the public is not very open to criticizing the monarchy in most times. And also the monarchy is perceived also as this guarantor of security to a certain extent. There is this general feeling in Jordan that this is a country which has a lot of tribal politics, a lot of different factions, and if there were no monarchy, if the king were to go away for some reason, these factions would not get along and there would be instability and perhaps conflict. And so we want the king to stay in place. And so why bother criticizing him? And if that king is not doing a great job, then what is your alternative solution? And this is kind of the public sentiment in Jordan that exists. And this is what is also used and instrumentalized to prevent any coverage in the press of the monarchy and the royal family.
As part of its reigning men, the other two kings that we've studied so far have been the King of Denmark, and as part of the Global Index from Reporters Without Borders, you've said that Denmark is ranks second. Then we did the King of Sweden. Sweden ranks third out of 180.
I mean, I'm not at all an expert on Europe and the monarchies of Europe, so I might be saying nonsense. But as I understand it, the monarchies in Europe have been really relegated to a more symbolic role. They have an honorary role, but they don't impose. They don't have this active power. Doesn't work from the monarchy anymore. It works from it comes from other political institutions. In Jordan, there is the king, and he is the monarch, and he assigns the prime minister, and the prime minister forms a cabinet, and the people approve of this cabinet, but they rarely not approve, which says something about their ability to make this free choice to approve, because you're not allowed to criticize the monarch. So if you disapprove of his cabinet, what is that saying about your opinion of the monarch? And I think this informs a lot of how everything else works. That means when the monarch chooses the political system, the political class, and you cannot criticize the monarch, so you cannot criticize the ruling class, the press is going to have a really hard time doing its job. That's not the case in Europe. But that is also the case, for example, if I want to compare the Jordanian monarchy to, for example, the monarchies of Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Bahrain or Oman, for example, there, it's also monarchies and they also have a lot of power, but they are more repressive in a sense, minus Qatar, which is an exception to its neighbors, and maybe a little bit Kuwait. But in the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, for example, we see a much more repressive grip on media outlets. In Jordan, there are civic institutions. There is a spirit of critique. There are journalists. There is independent press to a certain extent. There are some few independent outlets that do a great job. But the journalists who work for these outlets, they know how to protect themselves by respecting certain lines, not because they want to, but because they have to, because they've suffered in the past they've learned from what happens when you cross that line, and none of them would like to do that again. Western allies are way less likely to criticize Jordan for these perceived acts of censorship, for these practices, for these phone calls, for these interrogations. We've had journalists in prison this year, and Jordan went back 21 places in the ranking of 2023, got back up a little bit in 2024. I don't know what the results will be for 2025, but it has taken a step back. We've seen more repression, we've seen more arrest, we've seen more intimidation. We've heard from journalists who are more and more feeling repressed, who are self-censoring more and more. And this is occurring with not enough coverage. Like if you ask most people, they probably wouldn't think of Jordan as a place where these kind of things would happen. It has this perception of a more, in general, open and liberal place among the monarchies of the Arab world, which is true. It does fare better than most of them. However, repression does take place. But because of Jordan's relationship with the West, because of Jordan's importance, because of its strategic placement in the Middle East, it will get less pressure, it will get less criticism for doing the things it does. And as I said, there's this perception that the monarchy is doing these to maintain the peace and to maintain the stability. Unfortunately, that is not at all healthy for the public, for journalists who are working, and for the public interest in general.
Jonathan, thank you very much for speaking with me on It's Raining Men. It's been a pleasure learning more about the region.
Absolutely, thank you, and happy to speak again if you need anything.
It's a reminder that when we see King Abdullah pictured with world leaders or posting on Instagram sharing meetings with elected representatives, or magazines and tabloids publish the outfits of Queen Rania, that the citizens of Jordan can't critique in the same way that we might be able to do. Let us know what you think of what we've heard, or if you've got any questions about Jordan or any other of the monarchies in this series so far. Our email is itsrainingmenpod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to It's Raining Men. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends who also might be interested in kings, queens, power and palaces. And it would be great if you could subscribe so more episodes appear in your feed as soon as they're ready. And if you want to suggest a topic to be explored or have any questions about monarchies or specific members of royal families, you can find us on social media. Just search It's Raining Men. There's also a weekly newsletter on Substack too. Speak soon.